Okay, so like everything about like all the stuff we buy. I mean, like the stuff we use every single day.
Yeah,
And like it comes from all over the world, right?
absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's mind-boggling if you really think about it.
Yeah, it's an incredibly complex system.
It is, and that's what we're looking at today, like one really important piece of that whole global trade puzzle.
Right.
And that is Executive Order 14257, which is all about regulating imports with this thing called a reciprocal tariff.
Yeah.
So this deep dive generated by Portal Empresa,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to try to figure out, like, what's the logic behind it? How does this reciprocal tariff thing actually work, and what could it mean? What are the implications?
Right. Some big questions.
Big questions. Yeah, and we've got a lot to cover.
We do.
We're going to be looking at, kind of the history of U.S. trade policy, the reasons why this new order came about, some specific examples of, where tariffs just don't seem to match up.
Yeah, like the discrepancies.
Yeah, and then like how this reciprocal tariff thing is supposed to actually work in practice.
Yeah, the mechanics of it.
Yeah, so today's mission is to really get a clear picture of this pretty major shift in U.S. trade policy and why they're doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a great goal.
So to kick things off, you mentioned this idea of reciprocity in trade and how it's not exactly a new concept.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that while this particular executive order might be new to a lot of people, the idea of reciprocity in trade has been around for a while in U.S. policy.
So like how far back are we talking?
Well, we can trace it back to 1934.
Wow.
Yeah, and the idea was pretty simple back then. If other countries lower their tariffs on goods coming into their countries, we'll do the same for their exports coming into the U.S.
So kind of like a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of deal.
Exactly. It was all about getting these mutual tariff reductions going, and that idea really shaped things like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade the DTT, and later the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Right. And, those are institutions we hear about all the time when we're talking about global trade.
Yeah, they've become really central to how international trade is regulated.
So the idea with reciprocity from the start was to create like a more level playing field for everyone.
Yeah, the thinking was that by gradually reducing these tariff barriers on both sides, you could ideally lead to a more balanced flow of goods and services around the world.
But as this executive order is pointing out, things haven't exactly worked out that way.
Right.
It seems like the reality of global trade hasn't really matched up with that initial ideal.
Yeah, the order argues that despite this commitment to reciprocity, in theory, we've actually ended up with these significant trade imbalances.
And we see that reflected in, those big trade deficits that we keep hearing about.
Exactly. And the order really tries to break down why this has happened. What are the assumptions that haven't really held true in this post-war global economic system?
Okay, so let's dig into that. What were those assumptions?
Well, the first big one was that if the U.S. took the lead and really liberalized its trade policies, that means lowering those tariffs, but also all sorts of other barriers, non-tariff barriers.
Right.
The thinking was that other countries would follow suit and open up their markets to a similar degree.
So the U.S. would set an example and everyone else would be like, oh, okay, we should do that too.
Exactly. The second assumption was that this liberalization would lead to what economists call convergence.
Okay.
So the idea is that countries would start to look more alike in terms of their economic models, and that domestic consumption within our trading partners would rise closer to levels we see in the U.S.
Oh, so if everyone's buying more stuff within their own countries, it would kind of balance out the need to export so much to the U.S.
Exactly. And the third assumption, maybe the most relevant one to our discussion here, is that all this liberalization wouldn't lead to the U.S. running these big, persistent trade deficits.
Okay, but as the order makes clear, those assumptions didn't really pan out the way people hoped.
Yeah, they haven't materialized as expected.
Right, and it seems like the order is saying that while the U.S. really opened up its markets, a lot of other countries haven't really done the same in return.
Yeah, it's not been a truly reciprocal process in a lot of cases.
So this brings us to some pretty eye-opening numbers.
Yeah.
These differences in average tariff rates.
Right.
The order cites data from the WTO and says that the average most favored nation, or MFN tariff rate for the U.S. is about 3.3%. But then you look at other countries and it's a different story, like Brazil. They're at 11.2%. China, 7.5%. The European Union, 5%. India is way up at 17%. And Vietnam at 9.4%.
Yeah, so right away you see a pretty significant difference in the average level of tariffs being applied.
It's like we're playing by a different set of rules almost.
And it becomes even more stark when you start to look at specific categories of goods rather than just these overall averages.
Oh, so like instead of just the average tariff for everything coming into a country, Let's look at what they charge on specific things.
Exactly, because that's where you really start to see the lack of true reciprocity.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's take passenger vehicles, for instance.
Yeah.
The U.S. has a 2.5% tariff on imported cars. Now compare that to the EU, which has a 10% tariff. India has a whopping 70% tariff, and even China has 15%.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is, and it's not just cars. You see the same pattern in other sectors like network switches and routers.
Okay.
The U.S. has a 0% tariff on those, but India slaps on a 10% duty.
So our companies trying to sell those products in India are at a big disadvantage right off the bat.
Exactly. And it even extends to agricultural products, things that we might think of as being pretty freely traded.
Like what?
Well, ethanol, for example, the U.S. has a 2.5% tariff, but Brazil has 18%, and Indonesia has a 30% tariff.
It's like they're making it really expensive for our producers to sell there.
And you could go on and on, Race Apples. There are so many examples where these tariff discrepancies just really undermine this idea of a level playing field.
It's like we're trying to play a fair game, but everyone else is kind of bending the rules.
And it's important to remember that tariffs are only one part of the story. The order spends a lot of time talking about these other things called non-tariff barriers.
Right. NTBs, I've heard of those.
Yeah, and it draws on a report called the 2025 National Trade Estimate Report on Foreign Trade Barriers. It's a pretty hefty document.
I bet. And it goes into all these ways that countries can basically make it harder to trade with them, even if they don't use tariffs.
Exactly. It can be anything from outright bans on certain imports to complicated licensing requirements to customs procedures that are just designed to be a headache.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about those, like where they make you fill out a million forms and it takes forever to get your goods through customs.
Exactly. Or they might have really specific technical regulations that just happen to be written in a way that excludes foreign products.
It's like they're finding sneaky ways to protect their own industries without actually using tariffs.
Right. And then there's the issue of weak enforcement of intellectual property rights, which can be a major problem for companies trying to protect their patents and trademarks.
So it's a whole range of obstacles that can make it really tough for U.S. companies to sell their stuff abroad.
It really is. And these non-tariff barriers can take a lot of different forms.
Okay. Like what?
Well, there are things like sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, which are often about legitimate concerns like food safety, but they can sometimes be used in a way that's basically protectionist.
So it's like they're saying, oh, we're just protecting our consumers, but really they're just trying to keep out foreign competition.
Exactly. You also have things like discriminatory licensing and regulatory standards that give an advantage to domestic producers.
Right.
Or barriers to the flow of data and digital trade, or investment restrictions or subsidies that prop up local industries and distort competition.
It sounds like they've thought of just about every way to make it harder for us.
And there are even issues related to labor and environmental standards, which can create an uneven playing field.
So it's not just about tariffs. It's this whole web of policies and practices that can create trade imbalances.
Exactly. And the order even makes this interesting point about how the domestic economic policies of some of our trading partners can act as a kind of non-tariff barrier.
Okay, that's a new one. How does that work?
Well, think about things like currency manipulation or how countries implement value-added taxes.
Okay.
Those policies can actually have the effect of suppressing domestic consumption within those countries and making their economies much more dependent on exporting to places like the U.S.
Oh, so if people in those countries aren't buying as much stuff domestically, their companies have to rely more on selling their goods overseas.
Right. And the data on consumption as a percentage of GDP is really telling here.
GDP being gross domestic product, right?
Yeah.
The total value of everything produced in a country.
Exactly. In the U.S., consumption is a pretty high percentage of GDP, around 68%.
Okay.
But in a lot of our key trading partners, it's significantly lower, like Ireland, Singapore, China, South Korea, Germany. They're all quite a bit lower.
So that suggests that their economies are structured differently. They're not as reliant on people within their own country buying stuff.
Right, and that can create this pressure to export more to markets like the U.S.
The order lays out all these factors, these tariffs, these non-tariff barriers, these differences in economic structure, and then it ties them to the decline of U.S. manufacturing.
Yeah, that's a key part of the argument.
The numbers are pretty striking.
Yeah.
The U.S. share of global manufacturing output has dropped from over 28% in 2001 to just around 17.4% in 2023.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant decline.
And the order makes the case that this isn't just about economics, it's about national security too.
Absolutely. It emphasizes the link between a strong domestic manufacturing base and being able to, defend ourselves and protect our interests.
Right, because if we're relying on other countries to produce essential goods, especially in key industries like, automobiles, shipbuilding, pharmaceuticals, technology metals, and of course, defense-related stuff,
Yeah, all those crucial sectors.
we become more vulnerable, right?
Exactly, and the order specifically mentions concerns about low U.S. stockpiles of certain military goods because we've been supplying so much to other countries.
Oh, well.
And it also talks about how fostering innovation in these cutting-edge technologies like biomanufacturing, batteries, microelectronics, you need a strong domestic manufacturing sector to do that.
Makes sense. You can't just rely on other countries to develop all the cool new tech.
Right, and we've seen some pretty clear examples of the risks of relying too heavily on foreign producers.
Like what?
Well, think about the COVID-19 pandemic that really exposed how fragile global supply chains can be.
Oh, yeah. All of a sudden, we couldn't get masks or ventilators because they were all being made overseas.
Exactly. And more recently, there have been those attacks on shipping lanes, the whole situation with the Houthi rebels.
Right. That disrupted a lot of trade, too.
It did. And these events really highlight how events on the other side of the world can have a direct impact on our security and our economy.
And then there's the human cost of all this. The order talks about the millions of manufacturing jobs that have been lost in the U.S. since the late 1990s.
Yeah, about 5 million jobs between 1997 and 2024.
And those are good-paying jobs, often. So it's a real blow to those communities when those factories close down.
Absolutely. And it creates a ripple effect. It's not just the people who worked at the factory. It's the businesses that supplied them, the local tax base. The whole community feels it.
So it's a big deal. And the order argues that even though manufacturing makes up a smaller part of our economy than it used to, it's still really important for things like productivity, growth, innovation, and even our overall competitiveness on the global stage.
Yeah, it's a key driver of those things.
And it points out that a huge chunk of our exports are manufactured goods, and that the manufacturing sector is responsible for most of the patents and research and development spending in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a huge source of innovation.
And the order even brings up the fact that our agricultural trade surplus has been shrinking, partly because other countries are putting up new non-tariff barriers against our farm products.
Yeah, so it's not just manufacturing that's being affected.
Right. It's kind of this bigger picture of trade imbalances that the order is trying to address.
Exactly. And that brings us to the big policy change that the order lays out the implementation of this reciprocal tariff policy.
Okay, so let's break down how this is supposed to work.
Well, the core of it is in Section 2 of the order. And it's pretty straightforward. They're going to put an additional duty on pretty much all goods imported into the U.S.
From all countries.
From all countries, with a few exceptions, which we'll get to. But the baseline is this new 10% duty.
Okay, so 10% on top of whatever tariffs are already in place.
Right. It's an ad valorem duty, which means it's calculated as a percentage of the value of the goods.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it's important to note that this 10% isn't necessarily a fixed rate for every country.
Oh, so some countries might get hit with a higher tariff than others.
Exactly. The order says that there's this annex that lists specific trading partners who will have to pay an even higher duty.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're really trying to target certain countries.
It seems that way, and these new duties aren't temporary either. They're going to stay in place until the president decides that the underlying conditions that led to these trade imbalances have been, sufficiently addressed or resolved.
So it's not like they're saying, okay, we'll do this for a year and see what happens.
Right. This is intended to be a more permanent shift in policy.
Okay, so Section 2 lays out the big idea, the reciprocal tariffs, and then Section 3 gets into the nitty-gritty of how it's actually going to be implemented.
Right. All those important details.
So when does this all take effect?
The 10% duty kicks in on April 5, 2025.
Okay, and what about goods that are already, on a ship headed to the U.S.?
There's a provision for that. If the goods were already loaded onto a vessel and in transit before April 5th, they're exempt.
Okay, so it's not going to cause chaos at the ports or anything?
No, it's designed to be a smooth transition.
Okay. And we talked about exceptions to the tariffs. What kinds of goods are exempt?
Well, Annex 2 and Section 3B of the order have a whole list of specific categories that won't be subject to the additional duties.
Okay, like what?
Things like informational materials, personal communications, things that are protected under U.S. Code 50 U.S.C. 1702B.
Okay.
Also, steel and aluminum articles that are already subject to duties under Section 232 of U.S. trade law, they're exempt too.
So they're not piling on even more tariffs on those goods.
Right. And it's important to remember that these new reciprocal tariffs are in addition to any other duties, fees, taxes, charges that might already apply.
So it's not like they're replacing the existing tariffs. They're just adding on top of them.
Exactly. Another layer of complexity.
Now, you mentioned that Canada and Mexico are kind of a special case.
Yeah, because of those border emergency tariffs that are already in place.
Right. Those have been going on for a while now.
They have, so for goods that qualify as originating under the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, those goods will continue to get their preferential tariff treatment under that agreement.
Okay, but what about goods from Canada and Mexico that don't qualify under the USMCA?
Well, those goods are already subject to some pretty hefty additional duties under various executive orders.
Right.
So the new 10% reciprocal tariff won't be added on top of those existing border emergency tariffs.
Okay, so they're not getting hit with both.
No, but the order does say that if those border emergency tariffs are ever terminated, then the non-USMCA originating goods from Canada and Mexico would be subject to a 12% duty under this new policy.
Okay, so it's like they're kind of reserving the right to apply that higher tariff later on.
Exactly. And there are some specific exemptions even within this Canada-Mexico situation.
Like what?
Certain energy products and potash from Canada are exempt, and so are USMCA-eligible parts and components that have been substantially finished in the U.S.
Okay, so they're trying to account for those cross-border supply chains.
Right, they don't want to disrupt those too much.
Now, there's this other provision that seems designed to encourage companies to use more American-made parts.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It basically says that the reciprocal duty can be applied only to the portion of an imported goods value that doesn't come from the U.S.
Okay, so if a product has like 20% U.S. content, they only pay the tariff on the remaining 80%.
Exactly. It's an attempt to incentivize companies to use more domestic inputs.
Makes sense. Give American companies a bit of an edge.
Right. And the order also talks about how goods that come into U.S. foreign trade zones will be treated.
Foreign trade zones, those are like special areas where goods can be stored and processed without having to go through full customs procedures, right?
Right. So for goods that are admitted under privileged foreign status after April 9, 2025, they'll generally be subject to these new reciprocal duties.
Okay.
But there are exceptions and complexities there, too.
Of course there are.
It wouldn't be international trade without some exceptions and complexities.
No, it wouldn't. And speaking of exceptions, what about that duty-free de minimis rule for low-value shipments?
So that's for goods that are worth less than $800 generally. Well, that rule is mostly going to stay in place.
So those goods will still come in duty-free?
For the most part, yes, there's a temporary exception related to imports under a higher threshold, $10,000 from certain programs, but that's supposed to be temporary.
Okay.
And it's important to note that this new executive order doesn't change the existing executive order that deals specifically with low-value imports from China.
So that one's still in effect separately?
Yes. And to prevent companies from trying to get around the tariffs by routing goods through different places.
Like trying to make it look like something came from Hong Kong when it really came from mainland China.
Exactly. The order says that the new duties that apply to goods from China will also apply to goods from Hong Kong and Macau.
Oh, that's smart. Closes that loophole.
Yeah, it's an attempt to prevent what they call transshipment and evasion.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the rationale behind the order, the mechanics of how these tariffs are supposed to work, all those exceptions and special cases.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is. And it's clear that this is a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
You know, it has the potential to really shake things up in the world of international trade.
Absolutely. And the order acknowledges that by explicitly stating in Section 6 that the president can make changes to the tariffs down the line.
So it's not set in stone.
Right. There's some flexibility built in.
And what would trigger those changes?
Well, there are a couple of main scenarios. The first is retaliation if our trading partners decide to hit back by putting their own tariffs or trade restrictions on U.S. exports.
Oh, so it's like a tit for tat kind of thing.
Exactly. The president could then adjust the reciprocal tariffs in response.
And what's the other scenario?
Well, if a trading partner takes some serious steps to fix those non-reciprocal trade practices that the order is concerned about, and if they also get more in line with the U.S. on broader economic and national security issues, then the president has the authority to ease up on the tariffs for that specific country.
So there's an incentive for countries to play ball.
Exactly. It's a way to encourage negotiation and cooperation.
And finally, let's talk about those annexes. The ones that list the specific countries and goods that are affected.
Right. Annex I is the one with the list of countries that will have to pay those adjusted reciprocal tariff rates.
And those are the rates that are higher than the initial 10%.
Exactly. So, like we mentioned before, India has a 26% rate, the EU has 20%, and China has 34%.
Wow, so those are some pretty hefty tariffs.
They are, and then Annex 2 is the one that lists the specific goods that are exempt from the new duties.
And that's based on those HTS-US codes, right? The harmonized tariff schedule?
Yes, it's a really detailed list, and it covers a wide range of stuff. Raw materials like natural graphite uranium ores, certain chemicals, natural rubber.
So it's not just finished goods. It's a lot of components and inputs, too.
Right. So to sum it all up for you, the learner of the U.S. is making a big change to its trade policy with this reciprocal tariff order.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to unpack.
The goal is to address these long-standing trade imbalances that the administration sees as a problem, stemming from those differences in tariffs and all those non-tariff barriers we talked about.
And the idea is that by doing this, they can rebalance global trade flows and boost domestic manufacturing and national security.
Exactly. It's a bold move with potentially far-reaching consequences.
No doubt about it. And it raises a lot of questions about the future of international trade and how other countries are going to react.
Definitely something to keep an eye on.
So here's a final thought for you. The learner, given all those exemptions and special cases we talked about, which industries or sectors do you think will be most affected by this new tariff policy? And what about the unintended consequences? Those things that nobody's really predicting, but that could end up happening down the line.
Yeah, those are the real wild cards.
They are, and that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating to think about.
Absolutely. It's a real game changer.
It is. Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
My pleasure.
Until next time, the learners stay curious.
And stay informed.